Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword is the long-awaited 16th entry in the popular Legend of Zelda series. After a succession of unremarkable portable outings and a console entry that has not aged gracefully, Nintendo fans hoped that Skyward Sword would bring a fresh take to the classic series. Does it satisfy? Let's dive in. Skyward Sword, released in conjunction with the series' 25th anniversary, attempts to be simultaneously a celebration of everything that has come before, as well as an origin story. One may be concerned, then, that Skyward Sword might fall prey into the same trap that the Star Wars prequels fell into, attempting to set things up perfectly for all the games to follow, and placing emphasis on what the fans find iconic, not what makes for a strong narrative. For the most part, this isn't the case. Just as the main point of the Star Wars prequels was to tell the story of Anakin's fall to the dark side, Skyward Sword's premise is to explain the origins of the Master Sword, the legendary sword of Evil's Bane, featured in nearly every Zelda game since A Link to the Past. The strange aspect to this origin story, however, is that it changes very little about the sword's origin. The Master Sword was once a weaker but nonetheless holy sword that becomes more powerful over the course of the game. That's it. All this game does is add a little power-up section to the story of the Master Sword. So is this a story that needs to be told? No. But really, do any of the Zelda stories need to be told? They're all isolated adventures, few of them adding to one another to form an overarching narrative. Skyward Sword is no more superfluous than any other Zelda, but as an origin story, one might expect something a little more substantial. Perhaps the substance, then, comes in the form of setting a precedent for future adventures. This first Link is chosen by the goddess, and thus he will be reborn to fight evil in the future. The game also provides explanations for Zelda's continued significance, and even addresses Ganon's persistence in the series. My problem with these explanations is the conscious action involved. All these climactic battles of good and evil will involve these three characters because the goddess wills it so. Divine will removes an element of mysticism compared to divine coincidence, and I would rather that aspect remain mysterious. The role of the plot has been a point of controversy between fans in recent years. Some hoped that Skyward Sword would reintroduce the non-linear gameplay and bare-bones plot structure of the NES and SNES entries of the games, while others hoped that Skyward Sword would properly execute the compelling linear plot style that Twilight Princess attempted. Skyward Sword has adopted the latter approach. After critics lambasting the slow opening in Twilight Princess, Nintendo ignored these complaints and gave Skyward Sword an intro that's just as long. The goal of each of these sections was to create a sentimental attachment to the characters in the starting area of the game, so that the player will care when bad things inevitably happen to them. But while Twilight Princess attempted to make the player like an entire town of people, Skyward Sword focuses on a triangle relationship between Link, Zelda, and the new character of Groose. Both Zelda and Groose are strongly, if simply, characterized, and they manage to remain enjoyable throughout the game. I can't call them deep characters, but they're strong enough to make for clear character arcs throughout the game. These characters are never boring, but they do have the unfortunate luck of being compared to the villain! Lord Ghirahim is all kinds of great. Again, he isn't deep, but the writers were clearly having a lot of fun writing him. He's pompous, flamboyant, and takes a sick pleasure in messing with Link. He's a great contrast to Ganondorf, who is much more subdued, if angry at times. I was always glad when Ghirahim took the stage, and I hope Nintendo isn't afraid to try out new villains in the future. The overall plot structure falls prey to the common trap of the Zelda series. A number of MacGuffins are laid out at the beginning of a story section, and Link collects them all. After that, a major plot event occurs, and a new set of MacGuffins must be collected. This works from a gameplay perspective. The player has a clear mark of how far they've progressed and how much the work they have to do to progress the story, but at the same time, the story becomes predictable. The player can always see the climaxes coming, and as such will expect greater and greater climaxes. The story functions as a way to get players from event to event, but the formulaic nature of the game prevents any real twists from occurring. Pacing was a common criticism of Twilight Princess, in which the player would have to pace around a small area looking for insects before continuing on with the story. This behavior isn't completely gone in Skyward Sword. You will find yourself retreading old ground with a new objective several times in the game. The new objectives are generally interesting and different enough to keep them engaging, but a certain sense of progress is lost when you've scaled the same volcano 3 times. As I just noted, most of the exploration in Skyward Sword comes from reinvestigating old areas with a new twist. There are really only 4 areas in the game: the sky, the forest, volcano, and the desert. Each area has several sections, but the divisions between areas are frustratingly obvious. Much of the appeal of Zelda games is a huge, interconnected world where one can stumble upon new secrets and caves in a large, non-linear playground. In Skyward Sword, however, the areas have absolutely no interconnectivity aside from being linked by the sky as a hub. In addition, each area is more or less linear, sometimes with a fork in the path to create a shortcut to a previous area. The areas are streamlined. One walks from one traversal puzzle to another with little real exploration. The question of getting somewhere is never, where do I go? It's, how do I traverse this area? Dungeons, likewise, can be done in a more or less linear fashion. Dungeons feel less like one grand puzzle to be solved than a series of connected rooms, each of which features its own small puzzles. You'll never encounter anything like the Ocarina of Time water temple, for better or for worse. However, all this said, this linearity doesn't make for an unsatisfactory puzzle-solving experience. Each linear path must be traversed in a way that makes full use of a variety of different mechanics. Unlike, say, Final Fantasy XIII, which was essentially running down corridors, Skyward Sword makes every puzzle sufficiently clever. Progressing through the main areas is not unlike solving a single sequence of dungeon puzzles, and that's a good thing. Dungeons, then, are really only set apart by being indoors, using keys, and being slightly more combat-intensive. Traversing areas isn't about exploration, but figuring out how to get through, which is satisfying in its own right. Combat in this game is a contentious point, because combat is based entirely around the Wii Motion Plus accessory. The mere concept of motion controls has become something of a poison to many critics and gamers who absolutely despise any motion controls because they prefer buttons. And that's fine. If you want to skip a game because you don't enjoy the way it controls, there's nothing wrong with that. However, Skyward Sword features the best uses of motion controls to date, and you would be mistaken to pass on the game without trying them. The primary attraction of the Motion Plus is the swordplay. Unlike Twilight Princess, where the direction of a slash depends on how the target is targeted, the sword slashes in Skyward Sword depend on the direction that the Wiimote is swung. The sword can go in 9 directions: the cardinals, diagonals, and stabbing. This turns most of the enemy encounters into mini-puzzles, wherein one must observe how the enemy moves and slash accordingly. This is a major change from the fast-paced, acrobatic swordplay of previous 3D Zelda games. Link's combat is overall less stylish in Skyward Sword, and as such the combat is by and large less thrilling. Few items are used for combat purposes either, so most combat is based entirely on the sword. Most of the enemies are slight modifications of previous enemies. Bakugas are especially guilty of this. Combat overall feels rather lacking. The motion controls are a solid foundation, but future installments that follow the same style should implement a wider variety of moves and enemies to keep the format from becoming stale. Most of the items use motion controls in some way, although many are simplified to pointing where to aim. None of them function poorly, although rolling bombs can be somewhat temperamental. The constant use of the Wiimote for sword slashing makes sure that motion controls never feel out of place. Once you're in the motion control groove, controlling Link, his sword, and his items will become second nature. Set pieces are something hard to quantify and hard to discuss in these games, but it's important nonetheless to discuss them. Every Zelda since Ocarina of Time has had its absolutely amazing moments, those areas, items, events, and bosses that blow your mind with just how cool they are. After Twilight Princess's Shadow of the Colossus boss fights, Skyward Sword has big shoes to fill in order to appear favorably. I can't really say too much about the events, since telling you what they are would spoil the impact, but I can assure you, Skyward Sword has succeeded. Not just in sheer climactic power, but in some amazing creativity of concept as well. I wish I could say more. I really do, but I can't. So in the end, what do we have? We have a Zelda game that feels more linear than previous entries in the series, and retreads previous areas more than they might deserve. Its combat is solid, but could use expansion. Its story serves its purpose, with some questionable long-term effects. Its characters are solid and fun, but not very deep. All these things are good, not great. As a Zelda game, it's functional. But I can't let this review end on such a lukewarm note. This is a mind-blowingly amazing game. All those iffy criticisms go out the window when you're playing a harp with a quartet of behemoths. The creativity glowing from every orifice and awesome moments scattered throughout will exhilarate you. I guarantee it.
you.